Today is Sunday, the 8th of March, which seems the perfect opportunity to make a short video about where we are in the timeline, because Sundays have become this incredibly busy day with really no difference to Saturdays in recent years. On Saturday you'd go out, um, go to the shops, go to the cinema, go to the pub, go to the football, whatever. And then Sundays, you wouldn't do much more than maybe watch a bit of the Grand Prix back in the days of Ayrton Senna. You might go and visit your relatives, might have a walk in the park or a walk beside the seaside. But now, if I'm to leave the cave, I am just met by hordes of people. So I've gotten into this habit of really not doing much at all on Sundays. And I suppose if you made me king for the day, I would close everything. I would close the cinemas, the pubs, the restaurants, the cafes. Just leave open the little corner shops and supermarkets on limited hours. Force everybody to have the day off and just spend time with their family. And that could be interpreted, I suppose, as a kind of a theocratic Christian fascist desire to control people. But it's just about marking at least one moment during the week that might be quieter and where you'd have time to reflect, and where family might be the priority. Because regardless of what your religion is, whether you're Christian or not, or atheist or pagan or whatever, is sort of irrelevant. It's just having that moment which breaks your routine to consider what has happened and what's going to happen next. Like, one of the strangest sights to me during the sniffles was literally seeing people walking around in circles looking utterly broken because all their routines were broken and people literally had no idea what to do with their free time. Sometimes you'd see them at young kids, sort of exasperated, just wandering around somewhere where they could kick a ball. And it was all very strange, and people have sort of forgotten it without having fully processed what happened, because the next story line in the soap opera is always developing. So you never get to fully finish, consider, and process what you've been through. And in a sense, the Sunday is just a microcosm of that. It's just a sort of time to stop and reflect. A perfect opportunity to consider the Lamentations of the Bible. Now, there are a lot of very strange people in this world, some of whom who consider themselves Christian, though as far as I can see, really belong to Zionist cults. For instance, I got this leaflet through the door, whatever you think about the Bible, and I was curious, they're offering courses and books, and maybe I could join them, as I've nothing better to do. But it only took about 5 minutes of research online to discover that these people, the Christadelphians, are also a pro-Zionist group with pictures of them and videos of them, socializing and meeting with various, Israeli ambassadors and ministers, etc. So it seems, one of the worst things that happened to Christianity originally was how it developed into all these kind of sectarian sects, uh, reinterpreting God's word for their own political machinations and Machiavellian schemes. All very strange. And particularly all these Christians who use the term Judeo-Christianity, or who base any of their fundamental beliefs on the Old Testament, aka the Torah, rather than the New Testament. Because the New Testament represented a mystical understanding for the world, while the Old Testament was about creating an endless series of religious laws that the ordinary person could never fulfill. So they had to await for the arrival of their Messiah. So Christianity was a clear break in that. But still, people going to Christian churches and reading all this stuff from the Old Testament, it's very hard not to read the Old Testament and think that that the God described in this is Satan, that Jehovah is some localized demiurge who promises power in return for blood flowing in the streets. And I'll skip ahead here to a little passage I found, Lamentations on a Sunday for Jeremiah, chapter 1, paragraph 8. Let's look at this. You can read it yourself online if you want or whatever. This is, of course, the King James version. And some people would say, what is the point of reading something in such archaic language when you can read the Bible written in, modern plain English? And I would say there's several purposes. One is the literary influence the King James Bible has upon the English language and English literature, as it was probably translated by Francis Bacon. Or was it? Well, that's half a joke, really. But what happens when you read archaic languages, I believe you are connecting into archaic parts of the brain, into the realm of archetypes. And you can see that in how Jung wrote his quasi Gnostic Christian ramblings in the Red Book. So there is something about archaic language reaching closed or forgotten or dreaming parts of your mind. And what we see in our kind of idiocracy is language becoming more and more narrow, limited, smaller vocabulary. is it then becomes harder for ordinary people to actually communicate any kind of abstract concept, any legal rights or comprehension of such strange ideas as sovereignty or freedom. So I do believe like archaic language triggers archetypes sleeping there in the unconscious. But here is part of the Old Testament, the Lamentations of Jeremiah. And does it have anything to tell us about our current temporal moment? Paragraph 8. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned, therefore she is removed. All that honoured her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yea, she is sigheth and turneth backward. Consider that. Consider that for yourself. Does it tell us anything about today? Because the story of the Old Testament seems to be about people who live under impossible legal religious doctrine. And the story of the people living under the system is that they're always rebelling and rejecting God's word, God's command. That they are, in some ways, the shadow of the human race who believe that the world is always trying to destroy and persecute them. So instead, they do their utmost to destroy the world, to create their utopia. And we watch these prophecies unfold, and these prophecies often seem like that ridiculous idea that if you prophesize that your neighbor's house is going to burn down next month, and then you believe the prophecy is fulfilled by setting fire to your neighbor's house, it's all a ridiculous psychopathic delusion. And the Old Testament gives us these stories that are then fulfilled in the New Testament. It creates that all these things came to pass, and how the characters are like cyclical stories repeating in premonition until Messiah arrives and is rejected. And as a story, it's still very powerful, to think, if you ever think of what's going on in your life, in your own personal struggles, in coming into contact with that part of the human race that is sociopathic and narcissistic and psychopathic and generally deranged and malevolent. That original great archetypal story of the Son of God being born in flesh and returning to this world and being rejected by the world is to think of the power of that when you face your own rejections and trials and tribulations in your own life. To think of the cross everyone has to bear. To think that even God was rejected by this world when you face yourself dealing with the moronic masses and the mediocre midwits running everything on behalf of the top of the pyramid. So I do think that those stories of the New Testament can be understood as a kind of original mystical software programming, a sort of base code layer to understand concepts of energy and human experience and interaction that are almost impossible to put into words, because of course what was written thousands of years ago were all parables that relate to nature, land, agriculture, and we've become ever more removed from that. But all the parables are still understood, such as that faith can be as great as a mustard seed. In all the synchronicities we experience, it's impossible not to believe that we are in some sort of mirrored universe in constant interaction, revealing the shadows we project upon one another. And what plays out in the personal plays out on the world stage between nations and peoples and different religions and ideologies. And in the West, mysticism was sort of removed from Christianity and it became a kind of um, social control system where religion became equated to just being a follower, to being sheep rather than a goat. And as time went on, people felt something missing and were deliberately encouraged to go off and explore the mysticism that seemed much more alive in Buddhism and Hinduism and whirling dervishes and all these things that had kind of been written out of the Christian experience. Because if you go into a church to talk to a priest about your impossible synchronicities, experiences of the divine manifesting in your life, they have nothing to say to you, and some would even tell you that it's all just symbolic stories to communicate moral codes of behavior, which all spectacularly misses the forest for the trees. And it's in the trees that true cathedrals are built in vast, active, living systems, you could say. You know, I could recount a lot of strange experiences I've had just over the last year, but they're only meaningful to me, really. It would be unwise to use those as the basis of any intellectual argument, because that's not what we're dealing with. You know, the logos is one part of it, but the other is our direct personal experience through the third eye and the open portal of the heart. As we all walk through the shadow, the valley of death. And the world in many ways will reflect back to you what you believe. It's hard not to imagine that when atheists pass away, they get what they want, which is nothingness. That the universe obliges. But what I find interesting in the myriad of information presented to us, the endless options, the a la carte menu of spirituality presented to us in our local bookshops and various Christian and non-Christian cults, that promise of ultimate truth and community by conforming to ideology. Well, with all these strange choices which have been presented to us since the time of Theosophy, and before that going back to the splintering of Christianity, I always found it very interesting, that Rudolf Steiner liked to remind us, those be tempted to go on long treks to India or Nepal, is that there's great value in the spiritual traditions that we grew up with, because it's there as a part of our collective understanding, whether you think about it or not. There's so many phrases we use in everyday speech taken right out of Francis Bacon's King James Bible. The apple of thine eye, O ye of little faith. There's an extraordinary richness to all that's so easily forgotten and discarded and dismissed. And what we have in civilization now is a system that's only millimeters thick upon this earth, to be swept away at any moment. And you can ask, as you lived your life as a witness to history, how did you choose to react? Because that ultimately always belongs to you. And Steiner tried to tell us that you don't have to go to exotic places and engage with the demonology of ayahuasca to find a personal mystical path. It's all right there, what you grew up with. God is something living all around us in all the things that are alive. And all our ancestors were both pagan and Christian. And to reject them is to reject a part of yourself. When I look at the banal consumerism that is consuming Sunday afternoons, I don't call for a theocratic religious state to come into existence. I only ask, do you truly want to live like this? Is there anything more to life than shopping, TV, and Facebook and football? Will you grant yourself a moment's pause, rest, and reflection? Do you see value in that? Because I think what may happen when you go through the veil is that all that was unprocessed, all that remained in shadow, in this world, all then has to be processed in the afterlife. And we could imagine that those that do terrible things then experience some form of hell on the other side that forces you to look in the mirror, say, this is who you are, these are the decisions you've made. But people don't want the pain of doing that while they're on this side of the mirror, when they still have time to make choices. And it's to make those choices from a place of harmony and truth, while keeping your heart open to the endless poetry and motion of the natural world, sending its signs and symbols, its impossible coincidences, and natural magic, such as when you get into a taxi to travel on one of your most important journeys, and for the taxi driver to tell you that they're a Christian from Bethlehem living in exile in Ireland. So if we look at this book freely as an adult, when we only got odd and strange, confusing extracts and stories, it's only as an adult I ever sat down to read any of this properly. There was no one forcing me. I remember having like cartoon um, handouts telling some biblical story, but I never understood any of it because no one passed on the sense of mystery and love. So you're left as an adult to initiate yourself into the mysteries of this world, or just be subsumed by the dominant culture you find yourself in, where you're on an endless conveyor belt processing you into a transhuman future, which is ultimately all about the shadow, which is all about a counterfeit imitation of the divine, which feels such hatred and sickness towards itself. It wants to remove free will from the human race, because God asks you to turn to the light voluntarily, while everything that is satanic seeks to force you to do things under threat of law and violence. And anything based on such a system can only be against natural law and against God in rebellion. And we see such sick people in all our politics and dramas being played out. In some sense, it's all a strange dream, with things destined to happen and people destined to meet. It's just that one has to have ears to hear and eyes to see to notice anything happening. because everything is happening all around you in a microcosm of everything playing out in grand cycles. But at the same time, in this flowing dream, we always have choices to make. Even if it's only your reaction to terrible things, it's still a choice. So, of course, all the mysteries of the human mind and human behavior have most likely been decoded, analyzed, and incorporated into systems of control since the time of the pharaohs, and that the 0.1% at the top of the pyramid would say they know the cattle better than the cattle know themselves, and that they can claim some special quality in their blood, which is some fantasy about being the descendants of Sumerian aliens or whatever, as people can tell themselves any kind of story to make themselves feel superior rather than a child of God. So we go on in observation of the dream and ever awakening to the signs and symbols, to the auguries, the birds in the trees, the fox on the path. The song of the sea, the wind in your hair. And knowing while we're here, we are a witness